The attempt to suicide will no longer be a crime. The government has decriminalized any attempt to take one's own life. Kamaljeet Sandhu, our correspondent, now joining us live on the story. Kamal, we understand that the government has decided to remove Section 309, which is the attempt to suicide, from the IPC, and the centre says 18 states and 4 union territories have supported the deletion of this section.
Well, definitely. So the centre government, along with state governments, has taken a very sane and a sensitive view that attempt to suicide should be decriminalized. And one of the reason is that perhaps there should be a humane view. A person who is so mentally traumatized that he is willing to take his own life should be given another chance instead of being embroiled in legal controversies and legal hassles. These cases also take a lot of time, a toll on a person's mental well-being also. So this is something which was discussed in the legal terms. Legal experts were consulted, and obviously the state's view were also taken in. And that is how 18 states and 4 union territories agreed to delete the 309 IPC section in an attempt to decriminalize the state. And obviously the fact remains that this is a very humane value. This also puts India along with some of the other developed nations who've taken a similar view that there should be less mental harassment of somebody who's already going through a mental trauma so much as to take his own life. So this is obviously giving a second chance to a person who's already going through mental trauma.
Right. Kamal, stay with us. We also have Pramila Nisargi, lawyer and activist, joining us on the phone line. Ms. Nisargi, how do you see this? Because some are looking at it as the repeal of this anachronistic law that would relieve the distress of the suffering of a person.
Long back. What is the discrepancy? If the person commits suicide, attempt to commit suicide, and if he succumbs to death, then he is not to be punished. But if he survives, then he is to be punished. Where is the justification? I do not see any logic behind it. Besides that, a person who has no right to live, he says that I have a right to live. If I have a right to live, I have also a right to die. That's how I look at it. Okay. If a person feels that he is not entitled to continue, if for some reason are there, then she may die. But my only apprehension is that people may take advantage of it and they may pretend that they have committed suicide while in fact they would have been murdered. Only to that extent safeguards must be made, and it must be clear that it is only a suicide and it is not a murder.
Okay.
That's the only apprehension. Otherwise, this is a welcome move, and it has given hopes to thousands of people, like Karipasamma, who has filed a case, in our own High Court for euthanasia.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Pramila Nisargi, I'm going to bring in Abha Singh also right now, who's a senior lawyer in the Supreme Court. Abha, there's been a conflicting opinion that by declaring an attempt to commit suicide a crime, the IPC is also upholding the dignity of human life. Because human life, they claim, is as precious to the state as it is to the holder. And the state that way, in that sense, cannot sort of turn a blind eye to a person who is attempting to kill himself.
Definitely, if you go by the dignity of life, that the person has a right to life. So in that case, it violates the Constitution if you decriminalize 309 IPC, which makes attempt to suicide a permissible but bailable offence, and this punishment of 1 year. But seeing the number of suicides which are happening in the country with students in IITs, colleges, attempting suicide, authorities and parents trying to cover up because it is a criminal offence, and that is why they are not getting any medical help. They are not able to go for counselling because it's a crime and they need to register. So I think it would help the invulnerable people, the students, the people with medical problems, the mental health issues. So I welcome this step. Of course, one has to see, but the abetment to suicide remains an offence, so that nobody is forced to commit suicide on certain issues.
Abha Singh, thank you so much for speaking with Headlines today. Let me go back to Kamaljeet Sandhu. Kamal, the government, as we have been discussing, was also in the process, not only with Section 309 of the Indian Penal Code as recommended by the Law Commission, along with the amendment to certain other sections of the CRPC and the IPC. You can actually sort of enunciate for us what those other sections may be and what they relate to.
Well, this was the most controversial one. Remember, this was also to deal with somebody's own dignity to live. But remember, this is also about having a humane view of what really happened. The other sections obviously don't pertain to this, but definitely taking one's own life is a serious aspect, and it's always been considered a criminal act. But yes, behind closed doors, a lot of other things have happened, a lot of circumstances which never came to the fore. One of them is seeking counseling or coming to the front and accepting that something of a mental trauma or a depression is taking place. So this is one of those things, not to keep such things behind closed doors, to open discussions and deliberations on it. And that is why the state, the centre and the states really sat down on this. They had a high level deliberation and the views of the state were sought, and most of them came in an agreement that 309 should be deleted and the person should be given a second opportunity, a life of dignity. Right now, obviously, taking away one's own life.
Kamal, I'll ask you to just hold on there. We also have Vinay Tiwari, our managing editor, joining us in the newsroom. Vinay, there are critics of the law that say that it is cruel and irrational because it provides double punishment for a troubled individual whose, deep unhappiness had caused him to try and end his life. But there's also another conflicting view. How do you see that sort of affecting the government's decision right now?
No, I think the decision was long overdue because clearly, I think it's a recognition of the fact that somebody attempting a suicide is not exactly, you cannot solve that problem by punishing that individual. And I think one must remember that law and crime and crime prevention, there is an element of reform that must always be attached to it, which is why you see the whole concept of jails today is being modeled on reform, not so much of retribution. But obviously, it's a recognition of the fact that somebody who's attempted suicide, it wasn't exactly a result of somebody being deviant in behavior or being in conflict with the normal society. That's more a question of him not being able or her not being able to get the right kind of counseling or not being able to handle a particular situation properly. And that's unlikely to get solved if you punish that individual. And I think that is why 309 being struck down is something that is being argued for a very, very long time. And it's something that's long overdue.
Vinay Tiwari, managing editor, thank you so much for bringing us that update. We have, as you know, we have been speaking with many legal experts. They are welcoming this, but there's also been a conflicting opinion that by declaring this attempt to commit suicide a crime, the IPC is upholding the dignity of human life, but the centre decriminalizing the attempt to suicide, the bid to end life, not a crime anymore. The centre saying that suicide bids are no longer criminal, a landmark move that is in fact being made here. Let me go back to Kamaljeet Sandhu. Kamal, if you can actually give us a fair timeline of this, as we have been discussing, we spoke with several legal experts, our managing editor Vinay Tiwari also there sort of, breaking it down for us, saying that this was long overdue. If you can actually give us sort of a timeline, and B, what prompted the government to take this step?
Well, this all began during the UPA government's regime itself, but remember, this was a controversial issue. The centre had to discuss it with the states, and remember, law and order still remains a state subject. So they had to take all the parties and the stakeholders on board if they had to really apply the particular law. And most of the states also thought that this was unnecessary, creating legal hassles for somebody who wanted to take away his own life. So this was obviously about second chance at life of dignity. And remember, not getting these people bogged down by legal hassles. This is also about having open consultations and discussions, deliberations, also seeking opinion as well as consultation, whether we're talking about psychological or otherwise. These are the topics which have been earlier behind closed doors, not really discussed in open and public platforms. But most of the political parties were also of the view that this should be discussed in an open platform, that perhaps the entire concentration should not be on punishment, but also about reform, about having a second chance given to a person at the life of dignity, and also about the stakeholder per se. Everyone has the right to live. This is one of the important sections. But the fact remains that a person in mental frustration or otherwise in circumstances plans to take away his own life is something which has been seen as a serious crime earlier. And obviously with the legal hassles and the punishment itself, not many people reported such crimes. So this is obviously an attempt by the government government to get these cases to the forefront, address the problem. And obviously we've seen over the past few years how Ministry of Home Affairs recently also came out with the categories, the number of people who are attempting suicide, the age categories, the gender category, and obviously the number of issues relating to it. So this is not just related to the crime, but also about reforming. It's also about giving the person a second chance to live.
Let me quickly go back to Vinay Tiwari, our managing editor, who's also joining us on the story. Vinay, if you can actually sort of enunciate the details for us, because we understand that the Law Commission of India had recommended that this section actually needs to be efficated from the statute book. But the details, however, regarding the attempt of committing suicide have not been maintained.
That's right, and I think the Law Commission, in any case, one of the big tasks of Law Commission is to relook at all existing laws, and repealing laws is as much an important aspect of Law Commission's job as is creating new laws or recommending new laws. And I think if you look at the IPC, the 512, 13 odd sections that it has currently, even now there are several sections which are either overlapping in nature or in the language that has been used. Some of the language that is used in the IPC is still pre-independence era, which was then made by the Britishers and more in conjunct with the science society situation that existed then. But having said that, the only complication that I now foresee with this particular section now being dropped or be recommended to be dropped by the government is in India there are enough cases of people who conduct stunts outside government offices or buildings, or even political stunts where people threaten to commit suicide as a pressure tactic during a protest movement. So far the prosecuting agencies were usually booking people under 309 when something like that was happening. Clearly in several of those cases there was no intention of the person to actually do so. It was just a threat which was meant as a pressure tactic on a police force. I think that's where there'll be some amount of problem that the police will have in figuring out which section to use. But having said that, the IPC has enough sections, and actually more, which can be used to prosecute people who are doing something under protest or as a pressure tactic. 309 in itself was an anti-social law in many ways, because as you rightly pointed out, and as Kamal is pointing out, you cannot hold a person attempting suicide on the grounds of mental disturbance or being upset as being in conflict with law or conflict with society.
Absolutely, Vinay, but also besides, as you very pertinently raised these issues about of how this might be a possible loophole in the fact that Section 309 is in fact being removed. But what about political positions? Do you see any kind of problems there where there'll be certain quarters that will have an issue with this? Human rights activists, we understand, will welcome this move. We have legal experts welcoming this landmark move on humane grounds. But here we have 18 states, 4 union territories supporting it. Do you see sort of protests from any other quarter arising?
No, I don't see any protest at all. In fact, no logical, political or any kind of protest will be against this particular move. I think it's a move that is being asked for a very long time. Having said that, I must say that I wasn't exactly talking about a loophole in the law. I'm certainly just pointing out that that is one situation which the police will now face. But remember, the IPC today has several sections. I mean, you have preventive sections, 144 CRPC, which allows police to promulgate any order in a preventive capacity during a protest or any such movement, allows enough authority to the police to handle a case like this. The only thing is they'll just have to think a little bit harder now and work a little bit harder. 309 was an easy section to slap whenever this thing was happening. And remember, suicide or attempt to suicide is something that affects all age groups. We now have situations where even young children have been attempting something like this, either because of the influence of something they've seen or simply because there was lack of counseling. And that's something that just cannot be handled through a force of law. The police so far was...
Vinay, I'm sorry, I'll have to ask you to just hold on there just for a moment, because we have R.S. Sodhi, former High Court judge, also joining us on the phone line. Sir, a landmark move here where suicide is no longer a crime, as the centre has decided to remove Section 309 from the IPC. Your sense of it, sir?
Suicide was never an offence. It was only an attempt to suicide that was the offence. This was the only section, I believe, where if you did not perform a particular act fully, you were punished, you were held liable for an offence. To my mind, I think this was long overdue, and a person who attempts to commit suicide is not a normal man. He is under tremendous pressure. No one wants to give up life so easily. It's such a valuable asset, and the society should look upon him as someone who needs aid and assistance rather than prosecuting him and putting him in jail. I think it's a wonderful thing that has happened. It was long overdue, And I think so far it was a provision which was totally out of place.
Justice R.S. Sodhi, thank you so much for speaking with Headlines today. We also have Indira Jaising, former Additional Solicitor General. Ma'am, the government deciding to repeal Section 309 from the IPC, the attempt to suicide no longer a crime, a decision that will ensure that people driven to take their lives do not end up in prison in case they don't succeed.
Yes, I believe this to be a highly progressive move. And as your previous speaker was saying, long overdue. There was obviously a division of judicial opinion also on this issue. But ultimately, I'm glad that it is Parliament that is taking a step of this kind. As I look at it, everybody wants to live. The instinct to survive is so natural. And so obviously when someone decides that they want to take their own life, there is something very wrong happening in their life, and what they need is help, assistance, counseling, and hand-holding rather than being prosecuted as criminals. And that is why I fully agree with this decision.
Indira Jaising, former Additional Solicitor General, thank you so much for speaking with Headlines today. Vinay Tiwari, our Managing Editor, Kamaljeet Sandhu, thank you for bringing us that update. This is, remember, as the government has decided to repeal Section 309 from the IPC.